I'm the Director of International Relations here at Governance and Policy Think Tanks. Unfortunately, we're trying to join Dr. مرندی with this platform, and it takes a couple of minutes. I'm sorry to start the session a little bit late.
We can start it now. Dr. Merendی just sent a message to me that there was another interview. He will join us in a minute. We can start.
Okay. One of my friends just start with a question before starting the session. And it seems to me that many of the audience hopes that today we have a very good discussion. Ali, let me start.
Of course, yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Majid Afshani. I'm the Director of International Departments here at Governance and Policy Think Tank. For those of you who are not familiar with this institution, I would like to say that it's a non-governmental, non-partisan, university-affiliated think tank affiliated with the Sharif University of Technology. Sharif is the best regarding the international ranking, the best Iranian university, and we are very honored to be attached to such a very insightful and depth backbone. And here, I would like to say a few sentences about the institution. It has been established in 2015. In almost 8 years, we are trying to be one of the very newcomers regarding the think tanks in Iran, and non-governmental actually research agency. Right now we have almost 70 people and researcher here from many university, top-ranked university internally and internationally, and 10 different departments. 9 of the departments dedicated to the internal policy regarding economy, for example, parliamentary studies, regulating, and other department all of them have very good footprints in policy making of the previous government and current administration and maybe the next one, because we are a non-political actually institution. We work with every administration to make the governance work more efficiency. This session is one I think it's almost we had the chance to organize more than 30 sessions in this platform called International Governance Talks, and we have the honor to host many distinguished lecturers, and today we have a very good chance, and I'm truly very honored, and it's our pleasure to host Mr. Fëودور Lukyanov from Wildlife Club Discussion, and I would like to be short, just a very short introduction of our institution. Welcome, Mr. Lukyanov. It's a pleasure to host you today. And I myself have actually, I was thinking about lots of questions regarding this interesting topic, Iran-Russia relations in the transitional world, and these actually some evolution, some drastically changed actually issues we are involving in our region, and I myself very eagerly wait for your remarks and the time for question and answer. That's it. I would like to give the floor to my distinguished colleague Ali Salehian. Ali is a PhD candidate in international relations and focused in the Iran-Russia relations. And Ali, please continue the session and give us more time to ask our questions, please.
course. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Hello, everybody. I think Dr. Merendی has joined us. Dr. Merendí, you can enable your webcam and your microphone, of course. Hello. We just wanted to start the session.
Sorry,
thanks to Majid.
There was an interview that was supposed to end 10 minutes ago, but it got a bit contentious, so it took a bit. Sorry.
Good to have you, Dr. Merendí. Thanks for Majid for the introduction. Let's do the topic and go to the main point. I think Iran and Russia, as two great nations and the two old neighbors, have different understanding, history, and common ground for interactions. You know, different events, different histories happened between these two neighbors, from the Tsar era to Soviet Union to Russian Federation, and in Iran, from at least from Qajar dynasty to Pahlavi, and after Iran Revolution. These two old neighbors have, interactions, happening events, someone bad, someone good between them. And we are now in a time that different happenings and events happened in the international era and the global era. You know, we are confronting with Ukraine situation and framing Western and anti-Western countries. The Gaza crisis and the role of Russia and how it play a role in UN Security Council, and some comments, for example, Foreign Minister of Russia, Mr. Lavrov, provided with the Hamas or Israel, and the situation in Bab el-Mandeb, of course, and we have different things and issues like region. About the Persian Gulf Cooperation Council and Russian ministry and the statement about them. These all, I can say, driving force, shaping the understanding, the history, and the current situation and the future steps for both two nations. I think the one of the most important one is the economical side, about the north-south corridors or the sanctions or the military cooperation, and all these common issues could lead us to find a common ground for cooperation. But I think in this session we are really going to find an answer about how the decision makers, the people and the elites see Iran and vice versa. To doing so and to answer this question, we try to find the best elites and experts. We have the distinguished lecturer Fëودور, Lookianf, researcher director of Worldwide Club, and the chairman of Council of Foreign and Defense Policy, and editor-in-chief of Russia in Global Affairs Journal from Russia, and of course, well-known professor of Tehran University, Dr. Merendí, and distinguished advisor to the Foreign Ministry. Both of you have about 30 to 35 minutes to answer this main question, and then we will have about 20 to 25 minutes for Q&A. If you let me, Dr. Merendí, at the first we could use from the remarks of Mr. Fëودور Lookianf. We can hear you, Dr. Merendí. Could you enable?
Just one thing that I'd like to clarify, and that is that I'm not an advisor to the foreign minister.
Former advisor.
I was a media advisor for the nuclear. Nothing more.
Yeah. Thank you for your note. Mr. Fëودور, the floor is yours. Please enable your microphone, Mr. Fëودور. We can hear you.
Sorry, now you can hear me, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for this kind presentation and for this very interesting invitation. I was surprised to get it in December because I had no privilege to interact with your distinguished university and your center, but now I know much about you, much more than before. And I'm very glad to have this opportunity because relationship between Russia and Iran in the context of profoundly changing international environment is one of issues which emerge in our discussions more and more. So, first of all, I have to say that I'm personally not a specialist on the Middle East or on Russian-Iranian relationships. So, if you would like to ask me some very specific question, I probably will fail to answer. I'm dealing with the international context at large and Russian foreign policy, Russian priorities in this foreign policy. So from this angle, I will be happy to make short remarks. I will try to be concise because I think half an hour, that's too boring for the audience to listen to me. So probably it's better to answer questions, especially as I see that questions started to come even before we started to talk. So I will give you 2 points, actually, 2 broader points. One about the general situation and general perception in Russia about what is going on and what is the logic of Russian behavior in the period of, as we call it, special military operation, or as it is called in other countries, war between Russia and Ukraine. I think that's the very important element of any discussions nowadays, because Russia is going through the profound internal transformation and conceptual transformation of what our policy is about, our foreign policy, and even our domestic policy. And second point, more specifically on Russia-Iran, to the extent as I can address it, I will try to do it in the second half of my remark. So first of all, it should be said clearly that beginning of the military campaign against Ukraine almost 2 years ago came as a big surprise to most of analysts and most of commentators here in Russia. I was not an exception. I did not expect this thing to come. Despite the fact that the tension, international tension between Russia and the West, and particularly tension around Ukrainian issue grew for quite a while, for quite a long period. But frankly, we did not expect that kind of explosion, which was happening in February 22. Why most colleagues like me failed to predict it? Probably we underestimated the scale of accumulated irritation and, so to say, sadness and resentment on the Russian side, which was stimulated by the flat rejection of the Western counterparts, Western vis-a-vis, to even discuss issues which were of a vital security concern for Russia. In December 2021, as some of you probably remember, Russian Foreign Ministry put a package of demands to NATO, to the United States and NATO, which was de facto an efficient ultimatum, which was not for, so to say, for discussion anymore. It was for, so to say, acceptance or non-acceptance of what Russia wanted to see. And the key element of this package was to profound revision of the role of NATO in European security. And that leads us to the very beginning of the new era of Russian statehood and foreign policy after collapse of the Soviet Union, when the security arrangement in Europe and as a consequence in the whole world was created around the central role of the United States and the US-led alliances. So it's a long and very interesting story to follow what happened between Russia and NATO from early 1990s to late 2010s. That was a pretty complicated, painful, and sometimes very confusing line on the Russian side. Russia started with attempts to accommodate this US dominance in Russian international behavior and to find a place in the US-centered international order. Later on, especially in 2000s, after Vladimir Putin's arrival to the position of Russian president, he started to, after very big efforts to find common ground with Americans and Europeans, he started to seriously doubt that it was possible at all to get Western powers to accept at least something of what Russia wanted to deliver on the security agenda. The Ukrainian crisis, which started not 22, it started 2013 and late 2013 and early 2014, when American organizations and agencies hugely contributed to the regime change in Ukraine, after which Ukrainian state turned towards utterly anti-Russian, forcefully pro-American political line. And since Ukraine has from the beginning been a very much complicated and deeply split society, this profound shift from the balancing to the utterly pro-Western, pro-American policy provoked significant domestic turbulences, which generated a civil war in the eastern part of Ukraine. And then I will not describe the whole line of events, chain of events. We know that it ended up in conclusion on the Russian side that continuation of these policies will inevitably lead to the aggression from Ukrainian side, aggression from the side of US and NATO trained forces, which were being prepared in Ukraine. And at the end of the day, since Russia concluded, Russian leadership and Vladimir Putin concluded that the preventive strike was necessary.
Lookianf, I think our audience hears some noises. I don't know, it's from your...
I don't know. I have, first of all, I have this one. So, and on my site, I don't produce any noises, actually. I don't know.
No, I don't know. Maybe because due to the connection, there are some noises. Okay, continue. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, and this decision, however we evaluated, manifested a profound reverse of the whole line which Russia pursued after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This line, with some nuances or significant nuances, was in fact attempts to find place in the Western-centric world. the proper place, and Vladimir Putin, who dedicated a lot of efforts at the first period of his presidency to this, he really wanted to find common ground with Americans. But he failed because Americans had absolutely no idea to find common ground with Russia. They assumed that Russia, as a successor of the Soviet Union, which lost the Cold War, should simply accept the terms which Americans offered to the whole world and to Russia in particular. And that was no idea, no reason to discuss anything about taking into account Russian security and geopolitical interests. Since the war started and since this collision happened, Russian position has changed severely, and Russia actually turned to the opposite pole of the international behavior, from the position of a big country which tried by different means to find a way how to find its place in the Western-led world. Russia positioned itself as an utterly and clearly anti-Western force, which was the new one since the collapse of the Soviet Union, not even since the collapse, since the early 80s, 1980s, when we experienced the last peak of the Cold War. Soviet Union and then Russia never positioned itself as anti-Western, anti-American force in the world. Russia never coincided with Americans in all aspects of interest and policies, but Russia had no interest to be a full-scale opponent to the United States. Now it happened, and since that, all priorities for Russian foreign policy changed. I must say that the West, in particular European countries, led by Americans, contributed very much to the situation that this change, which happened with the beginning of the campaign against Ukraine, that this change will be, so to say, irreversible, because Russia, when started this campaign, hadn't in mind the idea to cut completely with the West. Russia wanted to get the West accept some of its interests, but the West flatly rejected this option as such, and started to isolate Russia and adopted the position which has been proclaimed several times since the beginning of the war, that the only way to end this collision is to deliver a strategic defeat to Russia. Strategic defeat of Russia on the battlefield. That was the main slogan of US, NATO, and of course of Ukraine, until, I would say very recently, until the end of 2023. At the same time, Europeans cut almost all official economic ties with Russia, including ties which people believed were impossible to cut, like the energy cooperation between Russia and Germany, for example. That came as an unexpected move for Russian side, because those who planned this operation, they, as I can imagine, they assumed that Europeans would not act in a way that could hurt and destroy their economic and social interests. But Europeans did it. And in this regard, the situation which emerged after the beginning of Russian-Ukrainian conflict, military conflict, is quite interesting, because Europe demonstrated that it has no interest to try to defend its own interest, and sided completely with the United States, completely. And we see a very interesting and actually a little bit strange development on the European side, that Europe is suffering a lot from this conflict and from the decision to cut relationship with Russia, while Americans, they rather benefit on this in terms of economic development, in terms of dependency of Europe on them and so on. So, but so far, and we don't see any moves from Europe to try to change this situation, which is extremely unfavorable to them. So since that, we see the worst form of the Cold War, the most severe form of the Cold War between Russia and the West, to some extent worse than it used to be practiced during the real Cold War, the Cold War in 20th century. Because at that time, Russia, Soviet Union, and the US/Europe, NATO, they had some kind of code of behavior and never broke communication to the extent as we see it now. So the current situation is probably comparable to the very beginning of the Cold War in 1940s, 1950s, when this new system of confrontational stability was not yet in place, while the emergence of nuclear arms and many strategic controversies, they contributed to the extremely high level of turbulence. So to conclude on this, I would say that Russia found itself in a very unusual position when relationship with the West, which were not excellent before, now are basically, relations with the West are basically non-existing. We don't have any diplomatic interaction. We don't have much of military interaction. Even the necessary confidence building measures which would be needed to de-escalate atmosphere in some areas, say Baltic Sea or the Black Sea, it's not happening. And this is very, very new. And for Russia, this is a very interesting psychological quest, how to quickly get used to the new situation when the West is almost non-existing in our consciousness. Certainly, it's not a reference point anymore as it used to be before for decades, if not centuries. And this is how Russian society is being confronted with this new situation. Those representatives of Russian elite who could not withstand this, they simply left. So after the beginning of war, I think several hundreds of thousands Russians who were flatly against what happens, they just left for Europe, for the United States, for whatever countries. And those who stayed, they are either in favor of what the Russian government is doing, or, how to say it, indifferent. They accept it and they find ways how to live in this new situation. That opens a new opportunity, and now I slowly move to the second part. It opens a new opportunity for relationship with countries which previously were overshadowed by the prioritization of the West. And in this regard, Middle East, the broader Middle East, the large Middle East, East Asia, Africa, to some extent Latin America, but less, those areas, those communities of states and nations become the indispensable field for Russian foreign policy. Partially because of necessity to find all possible ways to replace what we previously received from the West, and now we need to find replacement for that. Of course, countries like China are the most powerful providers of this replacement, but not only. So in this regard, we see that interaction and cooperation between Russia and Iran in areas which we could not imagine before. Now it happens, and suddenly I think some of my arrogant countrymen discovered that other countries, Iran in particular, some areas are more advanced than us. And this is a very, I think, very important discovery, very useful discovery to understand what is happening in the world. Of course, this current situation, especially as long as the war continues, and at this point we cannot say or cannot guess how long it will go. This situation is not the final one, and very much will depend on the on the end game of this military conflict. At the same time, even in case this conflict will be ended relatively soon, and this new situation will be stable enough to last for at least a couple of hours, frankly, I don't see this coming yet, but probably, who knows. But even in this case, I don't believe that after what happened, after the severity of the conflict we witnessed between Russia and the West in 22-23, after the scale which was a scale of support which was given to Ukraine from the Western side, the Americans and Europeans, I don't believe that any comeback to the status quo ante could be feasible and possible. So that means that after this war, Russia will certainly reevaluate its positioning in the world. And the current, I think, temporary way to do it, temporary framework, which has been introduced by Russian Foreign Ministry and Russian President Vladimir Putin, is the so-called civilizational framework. Russia has been proclaimed in the new concept of Russian foreign policy, the exclusive or unique state civilization state, which, from my point of view, if we try to decipher this formula, means that Russia is ready to primarily rely on itself. It has no expectations that cooperation with other countries, be it the Western countries or Eastern and Southern countries, will play as significant role in our positioning as it used to be. Again, as I said, it's from my point of view, it's not the final point. It's not the final destination. It's just an attempt to rationalize and conceptualize the current situation. As for relationship between Russia and Iran, I think that we have several levels of this phenomenon. On the one hand, we see that several obstacles which did exist before because of Russian interest to play different games with the Western countries, those obstacles are being removed because Russia has no chance anymore to play those games with the West. At the same time, even before this war, we saw Russian-Iranian cooperation in the Middle East, in Syria. That certainly will continue despite two circumstances. Circumstance number one is quite obvious, that Russian and Iranian interest in Syria, for example, or in the Middle East at large, are not opposite, but are not coinciding completely either. So we have different packages of interest there, which is very, very understandable. Secondly, in this particular situation which we have now, and that has been indicated several times by some officials at Russian Foreign Ministry, Russia is of course limited in its action because of Ukrainian conflict. Ukrainian situation is the absolute first-rate priority for Russia, and all other elements of international relations for our country are more or less subordinated to this. How relationship with other countries, whatever, will help Russian state, Russian government to complete the task proclaimed in Ukraine. And that means that in the Middle East, for example, a relationship with Iran is pretty strong and very important for Russia. But of course, relationship with other players like Gulf monarchies or Turkey are probably as important in different ways. In some cases, more economically, in some cases, like Turkey, for example, more diversified and geopolitically. But Russia will try to find all connections in this region, in other regions, in East Asia, in South Asia, in Africa, to address needs which are very vital because of Ukrainian war and because of economic war which the West started against Russia. I can imagine that this situation might be annoying for some of Russian partners because, of course, they have, including Iran, because of course, they have their own priorities and interests. But I think that a Russian policy in this regard will be flexible and clever enough to try to find common ground with all partners needed. But of course, in some cases, those contradictions might be quite deep, and different partners of Russia might have controversies between themselves bigger than Russia would like. So the clear example, which is not in the Middle East but in Asia, Russian biggest partners, very important partners, are China and India. Differently, but both countries are extremely important for Moscow. But as we know, relationship between China and India is not excellent, and the tendency is rather to downgrade this relationship. So for Russia, it's a very big and very difficult task to find how to balance this relationship and to keep them going with both sides, with both China, which is highly important for Russia, and India, which is also very, very much important. The same can be applied to some relationships in the Middle East, in the broader Middle East. So what is important to understand, I think that at the end of this collision, however it will end up, any reconstitution of this situation which we had before is absolutely out of question. It cannot happen. Partially because changes in relationship between Russia and the West, but more because of profound and very deep changes in the international landscape at large, which is generated not only and not entirely by Russian-Ukrainian conflict, but we see that all conflicts sleeping before, now they emerge again. And the Gaza tragedy is one of clear examples of that. I'm afraid that Gaza conflict is by far not the last one, which will wake up and explode in the foreseeable future. So the Russian assumption is that the international system is being changed profoundly, and this is an irreversible process, with the West slowly but steadily losing the dominance in the international affairs. And that brings Russian leadership to the conclusion, which I think personally is very much right, that in order to guarantee the future development for our country, we don't need to aspire to, in the first line, don't need to aspire to rebuild relationship with the previous leaders of the international system, like Americans and Europeans, but we need to strengthen, develop, and enhance relationship with those who are emerging, and those are multiple countries in the, as we call it now in Russia, the foreign ministry recently adopted a new notion, new term, world majority. World majority, this is in other words, non-West, the non-West. And so to build up relationship with this non-West is more vital for Russian development than the repair of relationship with the West, which is not inside. So this is the framework which I see, and in this framework, Iran is, despite all disagreements we might have or troubles which might emerge because of natural differences of interest, Iran is one of the most important and most powerful partners for Russia in years, if not decades to come. And one of the reasons is that the economic and geoeconomic landscape of the whole Eurasia is being rebuilt from the east-west line to the north-south line. And I can say that discussions about this new geography, geostrategy, geoeconomy is now one of the most actively developed discussion in Russian expert community. So it's not about geopolitics only, it's about new lines of communication, of transportation, and as a result of development of completely new proportion in the international equilibrium on the economic stage. I think that at the end of the day, Russia as a country which probably withstood the strongest blow ever, which was delivered in a very short period, delivered to a country. I mean, this economic shock, which came after beginning of Ukrainian war. So Russia demonstrated the high level of resilience, and this resilience is much more important than anything else, like geopolitical influence and so on, because in a new world, a resilience for decades to come will be the most important characteristic of any state. And here, I must say that both Iran and Russia are leaders, because resilience of Iran during 40 plus years under sanctions and resilience of Russia in this new situation, I think that might be examples for all the rest of the countries. So I'm ready to respond to any concrete questions about the Middle East, but now I stop here.
Thank you for your remarks. I think there are a lot of issues and questions and answers that you are trying to raise. Let's not lose the time and go to another panelist, Dr. Merendی. The floor is yours. And I just wanted to add a simple and a short question that, as Mr. Lukyanov said, in the world full of uncertainties, how we can understand each other intentions, Iran and Russia in this case. Thank you. The floor is yours, Dr. Mahmoud.
Thank you very
Excuse
much.
me, Ali, and excuse me, Dr. Marandi. You asked for a photo. Whenever you say, I can show the audience.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Uh, Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's difficult for me to speak now that we've already had a very excellent presentation. And the audience, since they're mostly Iranian, I'll keep it short because I think your audience is more interested in the view from Moscow rather than some repetitive statements made by me, whereas I'm not really an important figure at all. I just want to review a few things, and maybe that would help develop some ideas for the questions and the maybe answers. Iran-Russian relations have always been complicated because there's been a long history, which we all know about. I would say that there was a major shift after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the relationship with Iran and Russia evolved. Those who are older would remember that in the slogans that were chanted against the United States and the Soviet Union, we would have chants that these in demonstrations and in political gatherings against both the United States and the Soviet Union. But when the Eastern Bloc collapsed, Russia or the Soviet Union was removed, and Russia didn't replace it. So nothing was said against Russia. Russia was treated as a new entity, not a new entity that didn't exist before, but it was no longer the Soviet Union. So Iran no longer saw Russia as the Eastern Bloc, or as opposed to the Western Bloc, which Iran had problems with over Afghanistan and over ideology. So the Iranian-Russian relationship began to develop, in my opinion, in a very positive way. But obviously, for Russia, which at that time was very interested in joining the West, and in my opinion, it was destined to fail based on the Iranian experience, of course. That's my understanding. The Russians were always cautious about the extent of the relationship. Iranians are often critical of Russia in the UN Security Council when they pass resolutions on the Iranian nuclear program. But Iranians have to remember two things. One is that at that time, Russia was engaging with the West. And two, Russia was much weaker than it was today. It was a very difficult period for Russia. It's not a very dark period for Russia during the initial years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we also have to remember that Russia and China did force Western countries to change much of what they wanted to include in the text of the different UN Security Council resolutions. So a lot of the things that the Americans and their allies wanted to include in the text with regards to sanctions or accusations against Iran, a lot of them were removed by the Russians and the Chinese. So I would fast forward and move to what was alluded to earlier, quite correctly, another change in the relationship, which was the Russian involvement in Syria. Iran, from the very beginning, supported the Syrian government, and so did Russia. Both recognized that this was not some indigenous revolution. From very early on, Al-Qaeda was involved. We know from an email that was leaked by WikiLeaks, an email from the current U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, to Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at that time, in February 12, 2012, where he admitted that Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. This is online, it's accessible for everyone. So Iran and Russia knew what was going on in Syria from the very beginning. They knew that in another leaked audio that came out, Secretary of State Kerry, he said that we allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus to put pressure on Assad, President Assad. So Iran and Russia had intelligence about what was going on, so both supported the Syrian government. Iran became militarily involved in 2013, roughly. And then Russia joined after General Soleimani went to Moscow and spoke with President Putin and convinced him to join Iran. On two different occasions, the ambassador to Moscow at that time, who is a colleague of mine and a very close friend of mine at the University of Tehran, Dr. Sanai, he told me that until then the Russians did not want to enter the fray. But after that, the Russians came in and they succeeded in helping to change the equation. And I don't know how old the people are here in this room or in this session, but one of the first important acts that the Russians carried out was that they bombed ISIS fuel convoys to Turkey. There were two routes. One was directly to Turkey. The second went from Erbil to Turkey. And there were many thousands of tankers just going on for miles or kilometers. And so NATO was working with ISIS. They were openly doing trade and business. And then the Russians bombed this convoy. So the United States Air Force was flying over these convoys for a long time. They knew what was happening, and they allowed it to continue because it was in their interest. So that was the first, I think, involvement, and that continued. The Russians, until the end of the major campaigns, the Russian Air Force, in particular, was heavily involved in Syria. And during that period, the relationship between the two countries increased, especially the military, because senior Russian and Iranian military officials were constantly in meetings with one another in Syria. They were cooperating in all aspects. Of course, they were also in contact with the Syrians and others who were fighting against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates. But this created a new relationship. I would argue that and I think this is what was said earlier, I would argue that the Iranian-Russian relationship also took another change after the war in Ukraine. And I don't want to explain that because I think Mr. Lukyanov explained it very well. But what I would like to point out is a number of things that are potential pitfalls or problems that exist. One is that Russia, until the war in Ukraine, I think many elites in Russia were still optimistic that somehow the West would recognize their strategic interests. I think that the Iranians were always more skeptical because of our own experiences with the West. That from our experience, whenever we tried to move towards rapprochement, they saw it as a sign of weakness rather than as a sign of goodwill. And we saw that in the 1980s when Iran helped release hostages that were being held in Beirut. This was before Hezbollah existed. We saw it when Iran gave an oil field to a major U.S. company back then called Conoco. And then immediately after this deal was just when it was about to be finalized, after 2 years of negotiations, the U.S. slapped sanctions on Iran's oil and gas industry. We saw it in the JCPOA, where I was personally involved. I remember on the day when the JCPOA was signed, I was in Vienna, because back then I played the same role as media advisor to Dr. Zeddy. And I told him that, in my opinion, this will not succeed. And he was a bit taken aback, and I would like to add here that I consider him a very good, hardworking foreign minister, but I have my own opinions on different issues. I said that the United States sees itself as above the law, and so does Europe. So signing a document creates obligations for us, but that doesn't mean that it creates obligations for them in their own eyes. They can undermine those obligations. And I think the Russians had a similar experience with the agreements that were the Minsk Accords, for example, where these accords were signed, but the West was never serious about implementing them, as we saw the former German Chancellor, the former French president, and the former Ukrainian president admit they were never serious about the Minsk Accords. So, of course, I felt the same about the JCPOA. I felt that the United States was not seriously going to implement it. And I don't want to say I know a lot. I really don't. I'm much less informed about politics and international affairs than most who are involved. But I have a certain understanding of American society and culture. And I felt that my argument was later vindicated. My beliefs were vindicated. So Russia, after the war, the relationship with Iran began to improve. But the problem is that, like those Russian elites who are always hopeful that somehow they'll have some positive change in course and that the West will see the light and change its relationship with Russia, we have a similar segment of people in our own society. Good friends of mine, colleagues of mine, competent people, educated people, who, in my opinion, are somewhat naive in hoping that somehow we can solve our issues with the West. And we are influenced by the West in many ways, historically. But I would point out that we are also under constant Western media bombardment. So there are many more Persian language media outlets that are hostile to Iran than there are Russian language media outlets that are hostile to Russia. And the reason is that the antagonism towards Iran is much older. Russia became the great evil more recently. We've sort of been relegated into second or third place after China and Russia now. Of course, Gaza makes things a bit more complicated, but we have a long history where a huge media apparatus has been developed that is hostile towards you. Anything that happens in Iran in negative, it is immediately covered day and night by these Persian language media outlets. Fake news, truth, and falsehoods combined. But part of it also has to do with Iranian foreign policy. And so you can understand that these media outlets, and there are more Persian media TV channels outside the country than there are inside the country. And you can imagine how much money is invested in that and how many thousands of people are working for them. These media outlets obviously are hostile towards Russia, and they're hostile towards China, and they're hostile towards any entity that Iran has a good relationship with, whether it's Hezbollah, or whether it's Russia, whether it's Hamas, or it's China. It doesn't make a difference. They're hostile towards it because they want to undermine Iran's foreign policy, they want to weaken Iran, they want to turn the people against the political establishment in Iran, regardless of who's in charge. So anything that Russia does is portrayed in Iran in a negative light. So, for example, when the war in Ukraine began, immediately the Persian media outlets in the West said that Russia is a brutal and evil aggressor, that the Ukrainians were just sitting there minding their own business. And the history, the context, sort of very much like what we're seeing in Gaza, how the world began on October the 7th. And then, of course, October the 7th is full of disinformation, alleged beheadings and rape, all of which is now becoming clear that didn't happen, or at least there's no evidence that any of these happened. And I would refer people here to the Gray Zone in the United States, a very good media outlet that has worked on this. But in any case, the point is Russia is portrayed in a very evil light by these media outlets. And of course, it has an impact. There's no doubt that it has an impact because people are seeing these things on Instagram, on Facebook, and of course, these outlets are backed by big tech, and voices from inside Iran are not, to say the least. I've lost my Facebook account, I've lost my Instagram account, my Twitter account is constantly shadow banned, and I'm just an ordinary individual. The Iranian media, they're all sanctioned. Russian media, they're all sanctioned. So we can understand why people see, or a segment of Iranian society is repeating the Western narrative. And so any action that Russia takes, whether it's a statement on the Persian Gulf islands that belong to Iran with the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, or whether it's a statement by the foreign minister of Russia over with regards to Hamas and the war in Gaza, is focused upon by this media. And anything that runs the other way or goes the other way is not reported. And those people who support stronger relations between Iran and Russia, like myself, I openly say that, and I'm not the sort of person to get intimidated. Often, they are, in order to not be seen as pro-Russian or pro-Chinese or somehow, in some new Eastern Bloc camp, they sort of also quickly are quick to condemn Russia or condemn China or condemn whoever is condemned in these media outlets. That doesn't mean that for us this is acceptable. Obviously, the territorial integrity of Iran is not something that Iranians would compromise on. The three islands belong to Iran. Before the Emirates was ever created, the name of the Persian Gulf was around long before any of these countries existed. And so that's a sensitive issue for Iran. And also, Gaza is very important for Iran, although I think that if we look at the broader debate that's taking place in Russia, we'll see that Russian sympathies lie with Gaza, at least that's my understanding. But in any case, these are taken and enlarged and repeated, not because these people really care about Iranian territorial integrity. Many of these people in these Iranian media outlets support airstrikes on Iran. Many of them invite people who, on their shows, that advocate the breaking Iran up into smaller pieces. These are Iranians, so-called Iranians living in the West. But it is for their own interest that they try to create a divide between Iran and Russia, something which I believe is not in the interest of Iran and Russia, and I believe it's simply just in the political interest of Western countries. So if Western countries say something, make statements about our islands in the Persian Gulf, that's not a problem. But if Russia does, it becomes a big problem. Those double standards exist for the reasons that I mentioned. So my hope is that our good friends in Russia would convince the people in charge that these are sensitive, very sensitive issues for Iranians, and they create problems in the relationship. But I would also like to point out that the Iranian-Russian relationship has enormous interest for both countries and benefits for both countries and for both people. The North-South corridor, which is very important for Russia, especially as stated earlier, due to the importance of the Russia-Indian relationship, but also the connection between Western Russia and Chinese ports could also be enhanced through this north-south corridor. This is key to Russia. India is huge for Russia, and therefore Russia needs a corridor. But so does Iran. The north-south corridor makes Iran more important for global trade. It breaks the sanction regime. It creates a new access to Russian markets, and it also enhances Iran's capabilities in trading itself through this corridor. The corridor creates an environment of trade, whether the part that goes through Azerbaijan or through the Caspian Sea or through Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. So this relationship alone, I think, is key. The military relationship has been ongoing for a very long time, but I think that there's huge potential for this relationship. And the reason why these Persian media outlets are so hostile towards the relationship is because they want Iran to remain hostage to Western sanctions. They want the sanctions to work. So if Iran has better relations with Russia or China or any other country, that is something that these media outlets in the West want to disrupt. And I think that our friends in Russia should look at these issues from within that context. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You mentioned a very important perspective about Iranians, elites, and society, about how they framing or have framed about how see China. Let's go to the Q&A. Our friends and our audience can raise their hand for question, or they can leave their comments in the chat box. Before reaching to some questions from our friends that are try to raise from the very first moment of the initiation of this program, but I just wanted to say, I think we mentioned some common perspectives about, for example, framing as anti-Western force or resilience idea. Does this kind of things lead to a practical steps for collaboration? Because we are in the governance and policy think tanks, raise NIDA as a elite diplomacy and try to provide and make a bridge between countries based in the elite level and find ground, some ground, issues, and provide linkage, provide dialogue, as just like this session and webinars with different countries to based on these kind of common perspectives, find a good way for further collaborations. And maybe this is the very first step, but we are trying to do our best. Of course, with Russia as one of the countries who had such kind of interests. The question from Mr. Vahid Musavi to Dr. Lukyanov, I think he asked a question about the news that in Iran is very making significant, importance in and as about how Russia and Israel framing Hamas, and if I wanted to look at it, was Secretary Lavrov claimed that Russia and Israel are alike in fighting neo-Nazism as a state due to Russia's internal disputes. And I think we have another question about, I think Mr. Qomi, that mentioned how Russia sees Hamas' role in the future of Gaza.
Yeah, thank you very much. As far as the first question is concerned, frankly, I don't know which statement by Lavrov you refer to. Lavrov and anybody else from Russian leadership obviously didn't say this after the beginning of war in Gaza. Probably it was earlier, because but it quite a couple of years ago, until the beginning of the Ukrainian war, Israel, you know that one of Russian big concerns is that the West is redefining the historical experience and normalizes what Nazis did during the Second World War. It's very strange, but it happened, at least in form of very high degree of tolerance to neo-Nazist policies in some East European countries, in particular in Ukraine. And to the large extent, the ultra-right fascist movements and groups in Ukraine shaped the identity which paved the way for utterly anti-Russian policy. And Russia repeatedly referred to that in conversations with the West, but the West flatly ignored it, just didn't notice what was going on in Ukraine. And Israel, at least again until the beginning of the war in February 22, Israel was one of countries which supported Russian claims on this. Not very actively, but that was more or less same discourse in Russia and Israel about some Ukrainian specificities, to put it mildly. I think that it was said in this context. As for the current situation, of course, it cannot be interpreted in this way. Russia is critical about what Israel is doing. The Hamas question, frankly, I don't know whether Russian diplomacy has a plan or a blueprint what to do with Gaza after this war, as no one has. But as you know, Russia made Israel and the US furious by receiving a high-level delegation from Hamas in Moscow. And Russia keeps all ties, all contacts with Hamas. Russia is not in favor of Hamas, especially not in favor of what Hamas did initially, October the 7th and 8th. But as many other countries, Russia refers to the necessity to see the background, to see the roots of what happened. And the official Russian position is that this tragedy was the result of decades of ignoring the needs and rights of Palestinian people. To what extent Russia is ready to offer any kind of plan how to govern Gaza or to create a Palestinian state, I'm not sure. I don't think that we are there yet. But certainly Russia might be pretty instrumental at the stage of management of this conflict after the war, because Russia still has a very good contact with almost all parts involved. Relationship with Israel have deteriorated significantly, of course, in recent months. Even before that, because Israel was rather critical to Russia about Ukraine. But still, there are still ties, and if Israel will come back to some kind of reasonable policy, I think Russia will be able to serve as an interlocutor for all those who need it.
Thank you. The question about Hamas was from Mr. Mahdi, and Mr. Qomi mentioned about what is the Iran's role in the future of Russia. I think you mentioned about the powerful partner for years, if not for decades. But do you see the same perception or understanding between decision makers in Russia about Iran? Do they see Iran as what you mentioned?
Of course, the perception of Iran before was not even, so to say, was not flat and not linear. So, as you know much better than me, Russia supported several rounds of sanctions in 2000s and even beginning of 2010s. I don't think that we can expect any comeback to that kind of policies now. No. First of all, as I mentioned in my initial remark, the most pro-Western segment of Russian political establishment has left. Part of them live in Israel now. Not all of them, but significant portion of those who rejected Russian operation in Ukraine, they left for Israel, and it was a couple of very funny, if not ridiculous, stories that people condemning Russian moves against Ukraine stated in the social media that they leave for Israel because they cannot live in a country which attacks its neighbors. And many people were very ironic about this, because if you don't want to live in a country which attacks its neighbors, the last choice should be Israel, because it's certainly the country which does it all the time. So I think that the realization of importance of Iran is growing. Today, before our meeting, I had a conversation with a very old friend of mine. He used to be in business, then he worked for Russian government. Now he is again in business, and he is one of those who very deeply work with the state apparatus and big corporations about how to enhance relationship with Iran. And he said, frankly to me, that there are a lot of problems on both sides, on the Russian side, on the Iranian side, bureaucracy and so on. But he sees excellent perspectives for that. And I believe that he's right. He has no special bias for or against Iran. He just say that this is very, very good opportunity to have a good business in the future.
Thank you. Question to Dr. مرندی, again from Mr. Musavi, said the latest terror attack in Iran, especially in Kerman, same as some other attacks before, was committed by a nationality from Central Asia. How can Russia help Iran solve the terrorist threat coming from this region? Is kind of Shanghai or any other kind of cooperation, security one, could help us to to answer this kind of issues, and not only in the security dimension, maybe economical. Do we have the same understanding about how Iranian decision makers see Russia?
Well, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is an important platform for regional cooperation on security issues. But it's also another excuse for the Iranians and the Russians to get together over security issues that are linked to both countries. Russia, Iran, and China, actually, which are on the different sides of Central Asia, have similar concerns about extremism. The Iranians have always been fearful that the Americans will use ISIS in Afghanistan to spread extremism in Central Asia. And Iran is also concerned about the more extreme elements in the Taliban, that they may cooperate, or that they are cooperating with ISIS to expand their influence in Central Asia. And of course, the transport corridors, the North-South transport corridor, the Belt and Road Initiative, all of these can be undermined if there's no security. All of these will be undermined if there's no security. So I think that there are strong interests in both Tehran and Moscow that are very similar with regards to security. And therefore, the terror attacks in Tehran are linked to this broader concern about security in our region. Iran knows quite well who funded ISIS in Afghanistan, just like Iran knows very well who created ISIS in Syria and allowed it to thrive and expand. And so does Russia, because Russian intelligence has been deeply involved in Syria, just like Iran. And therefore, both sides understand how important this is to the future of our region and the future of Asian integration and the rise of Asia, because China being the number one economic power in Asia, and Iran and Russia being an enormous country, but both having huge natural resources, create a unique challenge for the West. Because at the end of the game, the number one enemy or the number one challenger in the eyes of the West is China, because of its sheer size, population, and economic capabilities. And Russia, of course, is very important to Iran, very important to the West. But for the West, I think it's very important to keep the countries of Asia as separate as possible. There's actually a photo that I wanted to show the audience. Yes, this is the Wall Street Journal. This was soon after the war began in Ukraine. This photo, I think, has very clear racist elements to it. And it is, I think, one underlying reason why the West, at least until now, can not really engage in Russia or Iran in a way that would be beneficial to both sides. In my opinion, it is this mentality that always makes Russia the other. Even though Russians are in Europe, or at least a large segment of Russian society is in what is today called Europe, and they look more similar to many Europeans, at least, than do most Iranians. But this otherization of Russia is something which I think is a fundamental reason why, even when Russia was, and including President Putin, was very interested in integration with the West, that this was not possible. And I think one reason why our rapprochement with the West is very difficult, and I'm not opposed to it. I think that Iran and Russia, they find an opportunity to have good ties with any country that is reasonable and legitimate and behaves normally, that they should pursue it, whether it's the United States or Germany or anyone else. Of course, for Iran, Israel is not a legitimate state. It is a colonial entity, but that's a different story. But this I think, also signifies something else, and that is a sort of unconscious or conscious view in the West that somehow Russia is Asian. And whether this is right or wrong, and of course, the photo is basically saying that Asians are aggressive, Asians are murderous, because it's sort of like the Mongolian, the hordes coming in and massacring and slaughtering and so on, sort of like what we're seeing in Gaza from European Zionists, or what we've seen across Africa by the Europeans and the Americans or Latin America. But this is attributed to Russia. So Russia is sort of seen as Asian. But while this is racist, it also raises another issue, and I think that is that they see this threat from Asia, not because of some military invasion of Europe, but because of Asian integration enhances the lives of Asians and increases the influence of countries, especially key countries in Asia. So what the West has always done in the past is that they've kept countries apart while you saw the creation of the EU or NAFTA, and regional organizations beyond Western control were always dismissed, or countries were encouraged not to join them. So for example, more recently with regards to BRICS, we see that with Argentina, where they refrained from joining. But in any case, I think that the racism aside, the spread aside, the fear of Asia and the rise of Asia is something very important to the West. And that is why I think that they're looking for an Achilles heel here. And one such potential would lie in ISIS or other such groups that could destabilize Central Asia. And I would include Afghanistan within the broader context of Central Asia.
Thank you, Dr. مرندی. I think Mr. Musavi just shared the website and the news about what Lavrov said. It's from Time of Israel. You can find it out in the chat box. Any other question? You can, our guests can raise their hand or leave their comments. I don't know, Dr. Afshani or Dr. Afrasiabi. We also have privilege to have Dr. Emamian, the co-founder of GPTT, with us. Also, you, Doctor, if you have any comments or question, you can raise your hand and we can provide the situation. If there is no question, I can ask my questions about. Yes.
If I may, the comment to this link, I just watched it. You know, Times of Israel is not the most reliable source here, because what I see from this article, they took from this interview exactly what they wanted to take. And the very fact that this is true, that Russia noticed and emphasized that Israel under Netanyahu and before, they did not join to anti-Russian sanctions. That's true. And they did not do clearly anti-Russian statements during the war. That's true as well. As for the statement that relationship between Israel and Russia is based on the common fight against Nexus, this is exactly what I mentioned. That it doesn't refer to the Gaza situation; it refers to the previous policies and the rest. As for the quote which they cite, denazification, demilitarization, I must watch Russian transcript because it sounds very strange. And I think they slightly distorted what he said.
I think it's really important if you wanted to consider that this news is being viral after the Persian Gulf Council statement with Russia, and the lack of dialogue between the two, at least at the expert level, you know, as you mentioned, caused
absolutely
misunderstanding, and this misunderstanding is not limited to the expert level. It could lead to the higher ranking of the decision making. And about Ukraine's situation, war, special operation, or whatever we can call it, how long it take and how people actually think about it? Because I read a policy brief from MIGMO that mentioned the war divided, and it's actually really examining the Ukrainian crisis and the situation. And what are the effects of the war, especially in the economical level and the sanctions?
You mean effect on situation in Russia?
Yeah. And how people feel about it, especially in the economical side.
Okay, that's quite difficult to judge. So if you would look at the day-to-day life, I don't think that many Russians noticed, for example, this wave of sanctions. In terms of ordinary citizen, ordinary person, yes, some goods disappeared, but they were replaced by other goods. Russian production, or Chinese, or Turkish, or Iranian, by the way, as well, something. And in this regard, the quality of life didn't change. The situation in the economy is complex and complicated, because on the one hand, as I mentioned in my statement, initial statement, the resilience of Russia proved to be much better than anybody could expect even here. At the beginning, when it started, experts and economists were pretty panicked. But we saw that Russian ability to withstand such a blow was much higher. Of course, the accumulated impact of sanctions will grow, especially when it comes to technological part. You know that from Iran very well, that the technology is the most vulnerable thing, and Russia, unfortunately, was a very deeply integrated part of global economy, and in technological field, many things we just received from Europe. That was such an enormous cooperation, and now suddenly everything was cut. Of course, again, the Iranian experience teaches us that official sanctions is not the final verdict. So there are many ways how to work with the previous partners without being noticed. And by the way, it was a question I saw in this on the screen, the question about United Arab Emirates, the relationship with them. And this is, I think, as in Iranian case, UAE, whatever they say, whatever they declare as official policy, but they are pretty well situated to find ways how to help. And in this regard, I think the role of UAE for Russia is comparable to the role they play in Iran. I'm very sorry, I need to open the door.
No problem. It happens in a live kind of programs. I don't know, Majid, do you want to add something, or we can wrap up the session?
Thank you, Ali. No, let's keep our questions and give the floor to the other audience. Just a few words. If there is no more questions, I can just say a few words for the closing remarks. And Ali, in the chat box, I saw another written question. Did you mention them?
I don't know, maybe I missed them.
Same person. The two last questions.
I asked you you mentioned China Airlines and turning into a trade to the US itself. I think that's the Musavi mentioned the question.
Did you raise these two questions?
I asked about to Dr. مرندی.
Okay. I would like to take this opportunity and thank both distinguished panelists today, Mr. Lookianov and Dr. Merendی. It was truly a pleasure to have both of you today with us. I hope that this institutional cooperation and collaborations between governance and policy think tank and the Waldai Club continues, because as you know, we are, both countries, I think we are suffering from the lack of direct talks at the level of the intellectuals and experts. As you know, we at our department, international department here, focus on this concept of expert diplomacy, and we would like to continue and keep these venues alive and productive, to have other participants, other lecturers from both countries to talk directly at the level of experts, intellectuals, mostly non-governmental, but very close to the government, to try to have influence on the policy making. And personally, I think there is some problems when you decide at the highest level to continue and to improve your relations, but you should be aware that it needs such a discussion at the level of the academia experts and other actually researchers, and trying to have a debate in the public about these relations. And we are here to keep this venue alive. And as I said, we are we would like to thank again both lecturers today, and I hope that we have the chance to host in person such a dialogues, even in Tehran or Moscow, and to join other uh, actually faculty members, other experts to join us and talk more and more about the relations between two countries. That said, just I would like to, on behalf of my colleagues here and Dr. Emamian, he has written his actually thanks, appreciations, and welcoming in the chat box. I would like to thank both of you and thank Ali for organizing such a very insightful and very actually informative session. I would like to thank everybody.
I would also like to thank you and your colleagues and Mr. Lukyanov for his excellent presentation. And I think we really have to not just keep the dialogue alive, we have to expand it. We've neglected bilateral ties, especially with regards to culture and politics. Iranians, myself included, know very little about Russia, and I think the same is true with Russians about Iran. We get most of our information about one another from the West. And as academics and students, we have a responsibility to rectify this. But thank you very much for this opportunity, and I learned a lot.
Thanks for
thank you for this initiatives. We need much more of that, and I hope to see all those who are interested to see all of you in Moscow, because it's very important to see how Moscow lives in reality, because it's differently than it is being described. And I hope to come this year to Tehran once again after a while, and then we'll see you in person.
We will be happy to hosting you in our think tank. I think this is the very step for our ties. We try to keep it and expand it. Thank you all and our audiences. Goodbye. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. الممنوع دکتر زحمت کشید.